Okay, so we are transitioning back now to our text. We're continuing in our series in Acts. And the reason I'm here reading the text and not someone else is because it needs a little bit of explanation before it's read. Because if you've been paying attention over the last 2 or 3 weeks, we have been talking about an important key decision that's been made in the life of the church. In a nutshell, they made the decision that Jesus is enough. We're rejecting the Christ plus something gospel, which is a phrase Scott McKnight, a theologian, gave us. We're rejecting the Christ plus something gospel because we believe in the Christ-only gospel. So for the males in that context, culturally non-Jewish males, Greek and Roman other, there was this argument whether they should be being circumcised to become culturally Jewish. Without that circumcision, they wouldn't have faith. Christ wasn't enough. And the big decision at the Jerusalem Council was, no, you're wrong. Christ is enough. Jesus is enough. You don't need to get circumcised because he's enough. And so that decision is affirming that faith in Jesus Christ alone is sufficient. Great news. We stand today, I'm guessing 9 out of 10 of us, from a non-Jewish background. But then in our passage we're about to read, Paul seems to forget the decision. He seems to go back on the decision. This is the guy who so passionately stood up with the other church leaders, Peter and James and Paul and Barnabas. They stood up and then passionately said, Jesus is enough. And now they're like, but Timothy. And here's what happens. Acts 16, 1-5. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him, of Timothy. Paul wanted to take him along for the journey, so he circumcised him, because all the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As he traveled from town to town, they delivered the decision reached by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem for everyone to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in number. Get this. Paul chooses Timothy to go with him on this mission trip. Timothy has a barrier to going. We're told he's got a Jewish mom and a Greek dad. He's therefore culturally non-Jewish, meaning he is not circumcised. Timothy's facing a decision. Do I go with Paul or not? Because it seems to be the decision to go, we're going to cover why, but it seems to be the decision to go makes a difference whether he is circumcised or not. And it really comes down to this. Is Timothy willing to obey God's call on his life to sacrifice so that God can use him for breakthrough? And more broadly today, I want us all to think about this, that God's call often includes personal sacrifice for breakthrough to take place. God's call often requires personal sacrifice for breakthrough to take place. So I want to walk through that statement, but just real quick, you read this and you think Paul's contradicting himself. A decision's been made, then circumcised Timothy, and then they're going on the road telling everyone not to be circumcised. All the guys, right? There's a certain, is Paul losing his marbles? What's going on? Well, here's the thing. Let's just dig into it. God's call, we're going to start with that one. When we think of God's call on Timothy's life, that call comes through Paul. And we learn of it because the believers in Lystra and Iconium likely saw Timothy as one of their leaders. It says that they hold him in really high regard. And so Paul is planning this mission trip, and he's probably like, okay, who comes with me? Is it just me? Are there others? And Timothy would have no doubt been a standout candidate because he's spoken so well of, and yet Timothy's got a barrier. Through no fault of his own, Timothy's got a barrier to going with Paul. The barrier is a culturally acceptability. It's a cultural acceptability barrier, not a spiritual one, not a maturity one. It's a cultural acceptability. Let me explain. Timothy's father was Greek and his mother was Jewish. Jewish heritage is passed through the mother, but due to the cultural norm he was brought up in, a Greek household, not a Jewish household, but a Greek household, his father's Greek culture, even although he had the Jewish heritage, he wasn't raised Jewish, and so he wouldn't have been accepted in the synagogues, the places where Paul would have gone to teach. Paul was called to both the Gentiles and the synagogues. He taught in both. He taught in the market square, but also taught in synagogues. And Timothy wouldn't have been allowed in. Even though he was Jewish by heritage, he was raised in a Greek home, brackets, not circumcised. And all of a sudden, Paul's like, this is kind of a barrier. This is going to be an issue. Why? Because he would have been seen as a second-class Jew, which would have meant he couldn't have gone in the synagogue. I'm also not going to pay attention to anything this guy says. So this was the barrier that Timothy was facing. It's unique to this context. So we don't have a lineup through the fellowship room afterwards for all the males who are uncircumcised. That's not. But can you imagine Timothy? He's this adult, and the procedure, non-anesthetic. He's an adult male. This is a high. We'll come to sacrifice in a second. But this is not like and that just happened. This is like a big decision. And it's important to remember that the barrier before him does not change God's call on his life. It's an amazing story. And here's the crux of for Timothy. We learn more of Timothy later in Scripture, but here's the thing about Timothy. Such is the clarity of God's call on his life that he's willing to undergo this painful procedure as an adult to be faithful to that call. Such is his conviction of the call on his life that he's willing to undergo such a thing. You see, we all face different barriers in following God's call on our life. Some are in our control, like some are not, like your family background. When we can do something about a barrier that might stop us moving forward with the call that God has on our life, through prayer and discernment, and I would say in agreement with a church community like this, we should do everything we can to remove the barrier that is making us ineffective or unable to step into the call that God is inviting us to. There are some really obvious barriers to fulfilling God's call. Bad attitude, unwilling to learn, you're too set in your ways, you're too set on change. But these are things, honestly, that can kind of, through a process of an ongoing process of discipleship, can kind of iron some of those things out, can become aware of them, and then we can do something about them. But what about some bigger things, bigger impacts where God's called us to something, and it has a sense of impact and change on our life? Are we as willing to do something about those kind of changes? So here's an example. Imagine you're called to a country that is predominantly Buddhist. And one of the conditions would be that in order to be acceptable in that culture, that you wouldn't eat meat. Would there be willingness in your heart to say, to respond to God's call and to be effective to that call, that I would become vegetarian? I had a lecturer during my theological studies in Scotland, amazing guy, my favorite lecturer. He'd been a pastor, but then a Christian missionary in Thailand for about 12 years. And his specific mission was to the Buddhist monks in the temples there. So he spent a lot of time, years, decade, building relationship. And I guarantee if the monks had walked past and seen Rory tucking into a big ribeye steak, he would have lost the right to come and engage them. Such is the barrier to his call that he was willing to sacrifice something like that for the purpose of being effective there. Choosing whether to drink alcohol in certain situations is a really good question. I drink alcohol. Many pastors and churches would be like, no, you shouldn't do that for all different reasons. I'm not getting into it. I'm not that dumb. But here's the thing. Whilst I think running an Alpha course up at Prairie Inn could be potentially the greatest thing on earth, if you were specifically called to reach out to ex-offenders, and the statistics around addiction with ex-offenders and people who've been in prison, exceptionally high. And if you invited them to an Alpha group and said it's going to be at the Prairie Inn, you're introducing a barrier, or you had them over for dinner and you know that they've had an issue with alcohol, and you're serving them alcohol. This is a barrier that you introduce to the equation for the call on your life to be effective in helping them meet Jesus. And the question is, are you willing to go without for the purpose of fulfilling God's call? Maybe you're called to reach out to people living in extreme poverty in different parts of the country or of our city or the world. Living in or near the context of where you're ministering removes the barrier of being an outsider. You know, when Fee and I moved into East London, there's this very, very strong feeling of like, you need to earn your way in here. Like very suspicious, very unwilling to offer an olive branch. And it took a solid year of just being in relationship. And we were desperate to live right in the heart of the community, but it was so expensive. We moved like 12 times in 2 years. It was awful, just trying for that not to be a barrier. Because it does something when you parachute in your fancy car, and then they'll learn who you are. They'll come to know, your money hasn't made you disconnected. It's like, but initial impressions can be, what have you got to share with me? Like, you're not one of us. You're not like us. So if you're called somewhere, and the call is to go and minister to people in poverty, it often is accompanied with a call of context. Come and be in that place. So you see, when God calls us, when he gives us an assignment, those are big things. It can be small things as well, however big, however small. Taking time, this is maybe a new idea for some of us, taking time to prayerfully take an inventory of possible barriers we bring to the sense of call which we feel God has for our life. It's really easy to say, oh, I'm called to this. You might be called to work with our young people, but you're a know-it-all. And so the young person asks a question, and you just can't help but answering them, rather than saying, wow, that's such a good question. Tell me more. Like, I love that you're thinking these questions. Can we just like walk together and explore that, rather than like, oh, I know the answer. Young people are amazing. They are developing. Their brain is like asking weighty questions. And the worst thing we can do is, so here's the barrier. The barrier is that you're a know-it-all and you step in and hey, we don't want you on the youth team. Being honest. If you love inquisitive young people who are searching and seeking, then and you love that side of faith of like, oh, God's so big and I'll never understand him all. You'd be a great candidate, because that's what young people respond to. Maybe you want to serve at Common Grounds, which is our Wednesday morning, 6 a.m., 6:30 a.m. For the last 12 or 14 years or so, we've been serving coffee to the folk in the hospital as they do a night shift turnover. A team arrive on Wednesday mornings and then they serve coffee. Let's just imagine what might be a barrier to you joining the Common Grounds team. You're a horrible morning person, right? You all know who you are, especially if you're with a spouse today. You might nudge them and be like, he's talking to you. And here's the deal. We don't want you looking like death warmed up outside, being like, here's a coffee. And everything in you is just like, I'm suffering for Jesus, right? They've just done a 12-hour shift. Get over yourself, right? Don't join something that you become a barrier to the call that God wants to place in your life. Just ask God, is the inventory being, I'm a bad morning person. I should not do ministries at 6 a.m. in the morning. Maybe you feel God calling you to pick up and move country or move place or move church. But the person you're doing life with, your partner, your spouse, your family, maybe they don't agree. Maybe they're like, no, I like it here. I don't want to move. I want to stay rooted where I am. And here's the thing. You bring a barrier of a lack of unity when you step out into those situations when God has not blessed the unity of it. I was 19 when God first called me to Canada. I had no idea what that meant. Just a whole bunch of people kept saying, God's calling you to Canada. And I'm like, bless them, Jesus. I had no idea what to do with it. 7 years later, I met Fee. And I said, hey, two things. I think I'm called into ministry. She was a pastor already, so that was fine. We kind of both agreed that was our trajectory. But the second thing was, and people keep telling me I'm called to Canada. I don't know what to do with this. And she was like, hard no. And I'm like, thank goodness, because I don't want to go either. But there was this feeling of like, why would we go? But for Fee, having zero sense, I probably had a growing feeling of this might be something. For Fee, it was absolutely not. 8 years later, God spoke to her and said, Fee, this is actually something for you as well. So it takes time for us sometimes to wait for the barrier to be removed so we can respond to the call God has on our life. We don't want to bring barriers into ministry, into the call that God has on our life unnecessarily. What we do about that is we take time to prayerfully think about the barriers we bring and then ask God, what does he want us to do about those barriers? It's important for us as we grow in hearing from God. Otherwise, we'll get it wrong and we'll start doing something that we're just not suited for. God's maybe not called us into, actually, and end up messing things up. So again, let's just revisit this main idea for today, that God's call often involves personal sacrifice for breakthrough to take place. We've looked at God's call. Let's look at personal sacrifice. Timothy is obvious what he sacrifices. The scriptures are full of men and women who sacrifice in different ways for God, who calls them. This idea of sacrifice, we don't like it because we think it's about giving up, kind of giving up our rights. But the word sacrifice is better to understand it as in the Christian context, in the context of discipleship, of following God's call, is not giving up, but giving to. So when we sacrifice something for God, a barrier that might be in place that we have to sacrifice so that we can go on that mission that God's called us to, it's not so much that we give up our right, it's more that we choose to give to God what is the barrier in the first place. You see, that becomes an act of worship when we do that. When we feel we just give up something, it's got a very negative feeling to it, but when we realize any response we make to God in obedience is an act of worship. So when we give him and sacrifice to him the barrier, however big or small that thing is, he repurposes it and he gives it back to us according to his plan for our lives. I read this week someone say that we all resist sacrifice. It's all too common for our top priority to be me. I've been reading through Genesis recently, and I've been so struck by the level of self-interest which was introduced to creation in the fall, but like the level of self-interest from day one after the fall is just heartbreaking. You know, Adam, I didn't start picking the apple off. She gave it to me. It's not me, God. It's her. You put her here. And then it moves on, and then it's just like, oh, I'd rather pretend that my wife's my sister so that I don't get into trouble. I don't get things taken from me. And so on. It just keeps building. And you read through Genesis, and you're like, are we that different? It's maybe way more subtle. When we don't like giving up something or giving to God, it's this feeling of this should be rightfully ours. This thing that I have is, money is one of the biggest ones. But if I do that, it might mean a career change and it might mean a lot less money. But what if you choose to give that to God rather than give up the money, but you give to God and say, I just trust you with what you're going to take care of. I'll just trust you with what you're going to do with that. Oh, but I've planned a big holiday this year, but then these Bransons, man, they can fire you up, can't they? And like, you want to go to the DR now, and but like, I've got the money for this, but this, all of a sudden I'm feeling God tug on my heart. It's just that prayerfully take an inventory of what a barrier might be. A barrier might be self-interest. And then you come and you say, I want to do this, knowing that when you give to God, he repurposes it and gives you something back that's always, always, always more significant. Not in money, not in monetary value, but just in spiritual value. By giving to God, including any barriers for God's purposes, is one of the most rewarding things you can do. It's one of the greatest gifts you can give God, but it's also one of the greatest rewarding experiences. As a people called into the world where we live, we raise our families, we run businesses, we teach, we're being educated, we're in the middle of retirement. Following the example of Timothy, who gave to God what was required, a really good place to start is just by asking, and prayerfully asking, is there something you're asking me to lay down so that I can be more effective in the world that you're calling me to? So reminding us again, God's call often involves personal sacrifice for breakthrough to take place. We don't have a ton of background and information about Timothy. There's the context in Acts, there's matterings through different letters. He co-authors a lot of the books in the New Testament. But then there's these two books called 1st and 2nd Timothy. They're not written by Timothy, they're written to Timothy. They're part of a triplet of letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus. They're called the pastoral letters. They're written by Paul to these younger leaders. And Timothy's willingness to sacrifice to God's call in this moment in Acts 16, you fast forward to 1st and 2nd Timothy, and what you see is this amazing picture of how God has chosen to use and bring reward, not monetary, not position, but fruitfulness, breakthrough in the city of Ephesus where Timothy has been rooted and based and where these letters are heading towards. These letters are so important in the life of the church because they outline what really good Christian leadership looks like. Now, let me just say this. A ton of Ephesus, a ton of the writings in Ephesians, that's the name of the book in the New Testament, a lot of it is highly contextualized to Ephesians, to the people of Ephesians, to do with roles with men and women and other things. It's very contextualized. My understanding of that is it's very contextualized because of what's happening in the city. It's a complex place. If Antioch was a very multicultural place, Ephesus was a multi-spiritual place. And right in the middle is Timothy. And he's creating this church and he's leading in a way. And at the heart of this guy who's willing to sacrifice, it just feels like God continues to bless him and his ministry. And what you have in Ephesus is this incredible example of Christian leadership. So a lot of what Paul says is not, you're doing this wrong, now do this differently. He's kind of going, I'm cheering you on, Timothy, my brother. I'm cheering you on. As you're growing, just be careful when false teachers come in, when they want to tear down and when they want to pull things this way. You're living in Ephesus. Ephesus is spiritual in every way. So be careful, be mindful of this, be mindful of this. It's more like he's like cheering him on. And today we can look at the pastoral letters, but especially 1st and 2nd Timothy, and go, man, this is a guy, like, we need to pay attention that when God put us a call in our life and we're willing to go through some kind of sacrifice in order to see that happen, God is in charge of what the fruitfulness or what the breakthrough looks like. We should want God's kingdom to break through. We should want it personally. We should want it as a church. And we should want it because Jesus wants breakthrough. He says in John 15, Jesus says in John 15 that every branch that isn't bearing fruit, he doesn't just like prune the edges. He like cuts the branch off and gets rid of it so that the overall tree can be fruitful. He's interested in your fruitfulness. He's interested in the journeys and the paths you're on, he wants to see you having breakthrough in the call that he's given you. His kingdom is a kingdom of breakthrough. What breakthrough are you praying for? Maybe you've never thought about that. Okay, God, I'm thinking about what you might want me to do with my time in my life, and now I'm retired. I got a lot of time, and what do you want me to do within these hours that I've pulled out and doing something else? God, is there a sacrifice in the midst of that might be a barrier for me to step into that? Okay, we've gone that step, gone this step. What breakthrough are we praying about? What breakthrough are you praying for? It may be that you're leading Young Life and you're passionate and you're thinking about the schools, so many schools that are not open in the greater Victoria area, and you're thinking, God, wouldn't it be a breakthrough? Wouldn't it be amazing to be able to have folk there? Maybe you've been wanting to start a Bible study in a place, and it feels like the person, okay, it just came to me. My family growing up, my parents planted a church, and they had a piece of land that they didn't own it, but like they were trying to buy it as a church, and they had been designated for the purpose of a religious building, but no one else wanted it apart from the church we were going to. And so they were like, can we buy this land from the developer? And the developer said, no, never. Like, it's going to be £500,000 and is worth like 100. So it's like way, way, way too much. And so for 2 or 3 years, they processed this, they prayed about it, and they came out of a meeting one day, and the guy actually said, this developer said to my dad and another guy, he said, it will literally take, me dying for you to ever get this piece of land. He said, that is how adamant I am about this. And so they came out of the room, and one of the guys, Jim, said to my dad, he said, we need to pray that guy out of a job. And my dad said, no, you can't pray that. That's wrong, okay? But they were like, God, we don't know what to do, but we need a breakthrough. A month later, the guy was promoted to a big job in London. A guy picked up the phone and says, can you guys come and talk to us? It was really confusing. This land is only worth this much, but they were trying to get you to pay 5 times more. I don't get can you just come in for a little coffee? And casually over coffee, the guy goes, if you can just give us 100,000 in 2 or 3 months, it's yours. And they had the money because they've been praying for it. They've been waiting. They've been kind of waiting. They just knew this was this place. So sometimes we got to pray specifically when we sense God's call. For them, it was like, plant a church. But then the specific breakthrough was there's an obstacle that we need to break through. And then they prayed and God removed. God broke through. So for us, we need to take that seriously. What breakthrough are you praying for in your life? Is it a family member that you've been praying for 20 years that they come to faith and you're like, doesn't look like it's happening? Keep praying. What breakthrough are you praying for? You see, the truth is that God, he wants to use you. He really does. He really does want to use you. Maybe you're on a crew, right, of guys, and in your context of running a crew of guys, you've got this amazing opportunity to encourage them, to disciple them, to mentor them. And their lives are going to get chaotic because we all are. And then you're stepping into their life and their world, and you're helping them recognize the Christ in you, and you're praying for them, and you're walking with them. And then when they have a breakthrough, you know it's, God just used me here. So what breakthrough are you praying for? God might be in the process of inviting you to change your plans. That's usually really scary, being really honest. When you're in the process of we had a plan. It was to have the farm, and now we're not. It was to It was to move out. It was to have parents here, and now, due to sickness and illness, they're not. There's lots of plans that change the whole time. But one of the big questions is, like, God, circumstances might change, but what are you calling me to in the midst of it all? He might be specifically calling you out from comfort to do something that you think someone else should do. Move? Well, that's what, like, that person should do. I'm really comfortable where I am, thank you, God. But God might be inviting you to change your plans. He might be inviting you to sacrifice something for him so that you get to witness breakthrough coming in a way in your life that you would have never dreamed of. You see, God's call often involves personal sacrifice for the sake of breakthrough to take place. And today, as we come to communion, I want us to remember that Jesus, he received the ultimate call, the greatest call from his Father. For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son. God gave his Son a mission, a call to come, and a rescue mission for us. His sacrifice was the greatest, ultimate sacrifice. People have died for their faith. No one's ever taken on your sin and the sin of the world as Jesus did. No one stood in the place of all the wrath and rightful responsibility we should have for that sin. Jesus takes it all on himself, so he gave the ultimate sacrifice. But in the resurrection, we see the ultimate breakthrough. The ultimate breakthrough that changed everything. So he received the ultimate call, he gave the ultimate sacrifice, and he accomplished the ultimate breakthrough. In Matthew 26, it says this, that now as they were eating, just having dinner together likely, sharing the Passover meal, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and he gave it to them, and he said, "Take this is my body." Then he took the cup and he gave thanks, and then he gave it to them, saying, "Drink it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." It's this moment in Jesus' ministry that points to the future. Whenever you do this, remember me. We're going to remember him today as the one who received the ultimate call, who gave the ultimate sacrifice, and accomplished the ultimate breakthrough. You might be finding, Craig, I kind of got a sense of God calling me to do something, or I'll start praying about it. But what if it's scary? What if it feels out of my depth and comfort zone? Jesus received the ultimate call, so he identifies with you. You can talk to him about that. You can ask him. But there's some sacrifices that I actually really don't want to give up. Like I don't want to move away. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. Jesus gave the ultimate sacrifice. He understands. You can talk to him about it. He'll help you. And then, Craig, I long for breakthrough. I long to see that happen. Well, Jesus accomplished the ultimate breakthrough in his resurrection. So he identifies with you. He can help you. Talk to him about it. We're going to share together in a time around the table, around the Lord's table. And today, that's what I want us to do. I want us to be thinking as we come forward. The call of God on your life. Maybe the barriers that he's asking you to sacrifice, and also the breakthrough that you are still praying for. He wants you to come and recognize his ultimate call, his ultimate sacrifice, his ultimate breakthrough. Because he wants to get back on the road with you. Come walk with me. Come talk with me. Let's wrestle this through together. I want to be part of your life. I want to be part of your prayer. I want to be part of your discerning. So as you come today, if you follow Jesus, you're invited to participate. Take the cup and the piece of bread back to your seat, and then in a few moments we'll gather together and we'll share that together as one group. You see, today we share this communion as a reflection, as a reminder, as a participation that we want to be obedient to the call like Jesus was, willing in the sacrifice like he was, and humble in the breakthrough like he was. Why don't you pray with me? And the band can come and the communion servers can come to you. Jesus, thank you that you are with us. Thank you that you are walking with us and that you are journeying with us. And God, you are so patient with us. But occasionally, God, we come to moments like this and we're asking, what do you think about the journey I'm on, the sense of calling I'm waiting for, or I'm thinking about, the sacrifices I'm wrestling with, the breakthrough I'm longing for? God, what do you think about all this? Help us realize, Jesus, that you are not standing back and distant. You are involved. You invite us to participate in communion, to show us, remind us that you are involved. You are with us. You just want us to trust you. And so, Jesus, as you received the ultimate call from the Father to come into this broken world and to give your life and sacrifice that we may have new life. As you received this incredible gift of breakthrough when you were taken up from the grave, we recognize it's that resurrection life that we so badly need because of our self-interest. We don't want to be turned inward. We want to be looking at you. As we share communion now, would this be a great opportunity just to remind ourselves of our need for you and of your availability for us to be with you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.